saw something on Amazon that I couldn't resist buying recently. I know it sounds like it could be bad, doesn't it? Um, and it's actually this. I bought this. I saw this. It's just a college ruled blank notebook. Like there's nothing fancy, but it was the cover. The cover of it says, "Well, that didn't go according to plan. Everything in 2020." Like. I couldn't resist, and so I thought, you know what, I think I'm going to keep this. And then, when I'm writing notes and planning for sermons and all that kind of stuff, when everything goes terribly, terribly, horribly wrong, then I won't feel quite so bad, and I'll be reminded that, well, things could be worse, right? And what got me there was thinking about like how many people's sort of 5-year plans ended up getting really sort of destroyed because of the pandemic. People who had a plan, they were gonna do something. It happened to so many of us, but more than that, to be really honest with you, it's because I spend a lot of my time watching fail videos on YouTube. And everybody in the Bend House has heard me rant at least once or twice about, like, what was the plan? Like, sometimes, somebody tries something really hard and then they fail at it, and you're like, okay, that makes sense. It was hard. Of course, they failed. But there's so many of them. There was no outcome possible other than the failure. Like whatever it was they were trying to do, like that was the only outcome that could be there. And I get a kick out of watching fail videos, and famously in our house, it's even more fun to watch Carrie watch fail videos because she just can't handle it, and it's absolutely hilarious. And I've talked about that before. But the truth of the matter is, our plans don't work out a lot of the time. Right? Our plans don't work out a lot of the time. We think that they're going to, we plan for them to work out, but they don't really. I think if we were keeping track, more of our plans don't work out than do work out. I don't know if you've seen the commercials for FanDuel, all the online gaming now that it's legal in Ontario. We watch football on Sunday afternoons, and every commercial is for one of these online gaming things. And one of them is actually kind of, it's bad because it's going to, destroy people's finances. But the commercial makes an interesting point, and it's that they're like, before you even got to the game, you already made a bunch of bets. You bet that you were going to get the directions right. You bet that you were going to get a cab. You bet that the food was going to be okay. Like, it's kind of interesting, and it's some people going through life, and they're underneath all these different things. You bet that you were going to get to the bathroom on time, and it kind of like has odds for all of these different realities in our lives. And I thought watching it, I'm like, it is kind of true. We all go through, we go through life pretending that it makes sense, and we're pretending that everything is going to happen the way we want it. But really, we're deluding ourselves into thinking that we have more control, we have more say that in the outcome than we really do. And sometimes I think we feel almost failure when our plans don't go the way we want them to. But at the end of the day, there's so many things beyond our control that are required for these things to happen in our lives that it's not really our fault sometimes. And I got thinking about all of it because today's passage is Jesus getting arrested. It's John 18, 1-14. So Jesus has just finished this big chat that he's been having with the disciples at the Last Supper. Especially in the book of John, it's a big, giant passage where Jesus is sort of giving them all kind of his last-minute instructions. They don't know that because they are still not quite catching on to what's about to happen, but Jesus is giving them all their last-minute instructions, and he's trying to get a bunch of stuff across to them. And so they've just sort of finished this whole kind of prayer session. Jesus has just prayed for them, and then they head out to the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, in the book of John doesn't go through all the Jesus praying and asking God to not have to go do the cross thing. He doesn't do all of that. That's in the Synoptic Gospels, the other Gospels. But all of that has taken place. So Jesus, they've had the supper together. They've headed out to the garden. Jesus has done all that kind of stuff. And then things take a drastic turn for the worse. And Jesus gets arrested. Now, I want us to try to put ourselves in the disciples' shoes for a second if we can. I always talk about the disciples were actual people. They were real people in a real time in a real place. They were like you and I. They were trying to get through life, And I want us to understand and feel what's going on by the time we get to what happens in the Garden of Gethsemane. There we go. I got it right. Okay, so first off, most of these guys would have been raised to believe that the best possible thing that could happen was to become the disciple of a rabbi. That's what you wanted. You went to school, you tried to be the best that you could be, the best of the best of the best, and you kept going to kind of the next level. But these guys were all chosen doing something with Dad. They were all chosen doing the family business. A whole bunch of them obviously were fishermen, which means they didn't get chosen. Now, the reason that matters is because Jesus comes walking along and says, I want you to follow me. I want you to be my disciple. That would have been the best day of their lives. The fact that they all leave everything behind and follow Jesus isn't because they're absolutely incredible people with incredible faith. The reason that they do that is because, of course, they would want this. This is what they wanted before. They're getting a second chance at something that they didn't get the first time around. And so they get this chance to be a disciple of a rabbi. But then they start to realize that their rabbi is a little bit different than the other rabbis. And then they've been walking around with Jesus for 3 years. They've been watching him do all of the things that we've been studying about for the last, I don't know, how long have we been in the book of John? 10 years? Something like that. Like, they've been watching him do these things. They have seen, like, to start things off, they saw Jesus turn water into wine, which would have been a fabulous trick, and one I'm glad I can't do, because it would cause a whole lot of problems. But like, they watched Jesus turn water into wine. They saw Jesus heal entire villages full of sick people. One after the other, after the other. They saw people who couldn't walk, and Jesus would come along, and he would pray for them, and they would get up, and they would walk. They saw Jesus bring someone back from the dead. A couple people back from the dead. Lazarus is still wandering around with them. They saw Lazarus walk out of the grave. And as all this stuff has been happening, as they saw him feed 5,000 people with one kid's lunch, after they saw all these things, they've been starting to think that he's the Messiah that they've been waiting for hundreds of years. For hundreds of years, they've been waiting and waiting, and they are starting to believe that he is the Messiah. He's the one they've been waiting for. So much so that they've said it a couple of times already. And then they are so sure that at any moment, Jesus is going to take over. Somehow God's kingdom is going to come. They believe that Jesus is going to overthrow the Romans. They aren't going to be oppressed anymore. They're going to be ruling. They believe this so strongly that just a little while ago they were arguing about who was going to be number two. Who was going to be second in command when Jesus came into his kingdom, they said. So this everything in them is believing that at any moment this is going to happen. And now they're in Jerusalem for Passover. If it's ever going to happen, it's going to be now. It's got to be now. Of course it's going to be now. And they know that Jesus has been weird the last couple of days. He's saying weird stuff. And they don't really understand it. Later they're going to look back and go, oh yeah, I get what was happening. But they probably think that Jesus is getting weird because it's about to happen. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. And they go and they have this Last Supper, and Jesus is giving them all these instructions, and then he's praying for them, and they're like, all right, here we go, here we go. And they go out to the garden, and Jesus prays, and they have a little nappy nap. And then Jesus gets arrested. All of a sudden, Judas shows up, and he shows up with not only the guards from the temple, because they had the religious leaders had their own little army, their own armed force. So they sent the guards from the temple out to arrest Jesus. But not only did they send the guards from the temple, but the Romans, they've got a bunch of Roman soldiers from the garrison at the temple as well. And they all come to arrest Jesus. And then shit gets real, because Peter gets all upset and he pulls out his sword and he chops the ear off of one of the guards, and everybody's freaking out a little bit, and they're like, we're looking for Jesus, and Jesus says, I am. And they all fall down, which is hilarious because he uses that that divine name again. All the soldiers fall on the ground. You imagine being one of the disciples, like, okay, maybe things are going to turn around again. Now, look, he's got power. Obviously, they all freaked out for a second. But then Jesus just grabs this guy's ear and sticks it back on again, and then gets led off to the religious leaders. Imagine how you would feel. Because none of them expected that to happen. None of them had any idea that was about to happen. How would you feel? What would be going through your head in that moment? Mark, in his gospel, helps us understand exactly how the disciples were feeling. In Mark 14:50, it says this, "And all the disciples left him and ran away." That's how they were feeling. They weren't even just confused. They all booked it. Peter and I think it's John follow him at a distance, obviously, sneaking after him. But all the disciples run away. As far as they are concerned, nothing at all had gone to plan. So what about you? What about you these days? What about you? Now, maybe things are not quite as drastic in your life as it was for the disciples. As far as the disciples were concerned, not only was Jesus about to die, but they were pretty sure that they were going to too. That's why they ran away. They're going to round up everybody and kill everybody. That's kind of what they did. So maybe things aren't as drastic in your life as for them, but have things gone according to plan for you lately? Are things going well now? Maybe for you, things have gone wrong. They blew up, got screwed up, failed. Maybe things didn't go how you believed they would go in your life recently. I don't know. Or maybe even not so much they didn't go how you believed they would go, but how you believe they should go. Maybe part of the problem is that you feel like you deserve for things to be going differently. You've worked hard. You've tried hard. Maybe when it comes to faith, you feel like, I tried to do what God wanted me to do, and I tried to live my life the way that God wanted me to live my life, and if I do that, then shouldn't things go better for me? Shouldn't things not be the way they are right now? I don't know. Maybe you feel cheated this morning or wronged by God. Maybe you're upset about something that God did or God didn't do. Maybe you are angry inside and you just can't seem to shake that anger. It's just in there really, really deeply. Maybe you're hurt or confused. I've been wrestling with this idea of what we do when things don't go the way we want them to. What do we do when things don't go according to plan? What do we do when everything seems to have blown up? The idea of lament, we've talked about a few times. I talk about it a lot when I'm leading worship. The idea that there has to be room in our relationship with God, not only for praise and not only for us to ask God for things, but there has to be room to be angry and upset. There needs to be room to be sad. And so I think we start with this idea of lament. I looked up the definition of the word. It means to mourn aloud. There's something about that, aloud, not quietly, not to yourself, not to just sort of turn it over and over in your head, but to mourn aloud, to wail, to express sorrow, mourning, or regret. And I love how the definition says, often demonstratively. People should, if somebody was nearby you, they should be able to tell that you are lamenting. You almost can't lament secretly, maybe. And this idea of lament is popular, and it exists in Scripture a lot. In fact, there's an entire book called Lamentations. It's a book of laments. It's a bunch of laments about the destruction of the temple. And the writers are just laying it all out before God, their hurt, their sorrow, their brokenness, their anger, their frustration, their confusion, and it's an entire book of the Bible dedicated to that. I was thinking about Psalm 13 this past, last week we were at district retreat, and somebody read this psalm. It's an example of a lament. And it's David writes it. And we try to figure out why he wrote this psalm, and there's some people that guess at what he's writing it about. But I actually think that at the end of the day, I think there's a lot of moments in David's life that this could have been about. And when I hear this psalm, there's moments that I kind of feel like I connect with it. How long will you forget me, Lord? I've been there sometimes where I'm like, hey, are you paying attention? Are you paying attention to what's going on down here? Are you paying attention to what's going on in my life? Have you forgotten about me? Did you get distracted? Did something else happen? Do you need to borrow some of my ADHD pills? Like, what's going on? Because, like, how long will you forget me, Lord? Forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long will I be left to my own wits with agony filling my heart? Daily? How long will my enemy keep defeating me? There are times where I look at my life and I think, why do the wicked prosper? I think, God, like, why is it so hard? Why is it such a struggle? Look at me. Answer me, Lord my God. Restore sight to my eyes. Otherwise, I will sleep the sleep of death. And my enemy will say, I won. My foes rejoice over my downfall. There are some scholars who believe that what David is saying there is he's saying, look at me, answer me, Lord my God, or I'm going to kill myself. I can't do this anymore. Where are you? Show up. Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt that way? This morning at worship practice, the first song is called 40. It's by U2, but it's a psalm. And it's in the key of E. And so Jennifer saw the title. It said 40 brackets E, and she thought it was E for explicit lyrics. And so I sort of joked, and I said, you know, it would work. It would work to make it explicit lyrics. It would work to add some of those words in there, because it would actually capture the pain and the frustration. This is another good example that would work really well to add some choice words into it. It would capture what David is feeling here. So maybe this morning you need to lament a little bit. Maybe you need to take some time to let God know how you're actually feeling about life at the moment. Time to be honest with God. Here's the thing, there's absolutely no point in lying to God. What's the point? He already knows. He knows what you're thinking. He knows what you're feeling. He knows the situation you're in. So trying to pretend like everything is okay when it's not okay doesn't really make any sense, does it? It's okay to lament. One of the things I love is the reality that David is called a man after God's own heart, and he writes these kinds of psalms. So God says, I looked around, and here's a guy who actually gets me, a guy who wants to be connected to me, a guy that I love and care about, and I'm in a relationship with. I love this guy. But David writes these kinds of psalms. That tells me it's okay. And then the other thing I was thinking about this week that really gave me a lot of hope is the disciples all took off. When Jesus gets arrested, they all flee. And in fact, scholars think that Mark actually ended up having to run away buck naked. Because in his book, there's a thing. They all flee, and somebody grabbed one of their cloaks, and he jumped out of his cloak, and he ran away naked. And he doesn't say who it is, and so scholars think it is Mark, and so he didn't want to say that it was him. But that's not a good look, right? Running away is bad. Running away buck naked is worse. There's no way to be tough, be cool after that. Like, I picture screaming at the, oh, like nothing good happened out of that. And they changed the world. We are here this morning doing this because those disciples went to the entire known world at the time and told people about Jesus and shared the message and life of Jesus with people. And this morning, we're here because of them. That gives me hope. Because if you can fail that badly and still be used by God, there's a chance for me yet. But how is David okay with all of this? Here's the thing I've been wrestling with. How is David all right with all of this? David ends with a couple of interesting verses in that psalm. So Psalm 13 ends with this. 5 and 6 say, "But I have trusted in your faithful love. My heart will rejoice in your salvation. Yes, I will sing to the Lord because he has been good to me." The key is in the tenses here. Look at the tenses. Yeah. But I have trusted in your faithful love, and I will rejoice. I will sing because he has been good. David looks backwards in order to look forward. He doesn't look at what's going on right in his present, because what's going on in his present is crappy. What's going on in his present is anger and hurt and pain and frustration. His enemies are coming at him, and in his case, it was very literal in his case. People were literally trying to kill him often. And so instead of getting frustrated, he looks back at God's track record and he begins to base his faith on what God has already done in his life. Faith isn't certainty either, right? Faith isn't certainty. Faith is this understanding that doesn't know for sure, but he's decided to put his trust, he's decided to place his faith in something, and that is ultimately in God. And ultimately what he's decided to do is put his faith in the reality that God is bigger than the problems that he's having. Now here's the thing, I'm talking about something this morning that I haven't really finished wrestling with. At Vox, we try to create a place for people. The fancy term is deconstructing, but most of you are here and have stuck around, and most people kind of come to Vox because they have struggled with faith, and they've lost faith. Their faith has been very difficult, and they weren't sure what they believe anymore, and so there's a period of kind of tearing it all down so we can start to build it back up again. And there's this concept, this theological concept that I struggle with in all of this, and it's the concept of the sovereignty of God. It's the idea that God is king. I struggle with it a lot because our example of kings are almost all bad. It hasn't been a good thing for humanity for the most part. Most kings were evil. Most kings were selfish. Most kings took advantage and oppressed and all this kind of stuff. And so I struggle with this idea of sovereignty. I don't know what to do with it, but it's a doctrine that flows all the way through Scripture. And so it's one of these things that we have to actually deal with. It's one of the ways of talking about God that flows from Genesis all the way to Revelation. Now, the fancy definition of the sovereignty of God is this: to affirm that God is sovereign is to affirm that God reigns universally and invincibly. God's sovereignty implies his absolute ownership, authority, and control over all things. This idea that nothing is outside of God's control or beyond God's control. Nothing is outside of his reign as king. Psalm 47:2 is a good example of the titles, right? Because the Lord Most High is awesome. He is the great king of the whole world. In the New Testament, we talk a lot about the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, this idea that nothing is above or outside of God's control. But it's more, the reason that I've been wrestling with is it's more than just this idea of God as the ultimate boss, God as the ultimate authority, God as the ultimate, almost puppet master. For me, there's something about it that it has to do with God's size. And I don't know how to put that in words yet. So I thought, well, I guess I'll preach on it. That'll work. But here's the thing, have you ever stood how many of you have seen the Rockies in person? Quite a few. There's something about standing at the foot of the Rockies that is hard to comprehend. It's just too big, right? Like you get in and you can't get it all in one view. Do you know what I mean? You can't grasp the size of it, the magnitude, thank you. You can't grasp the magnitude of it. I've been trying to understand this reality with God. The first message that Trevor ever preached here was on this idea, and he was talking about the size of the universe, and he had this whole kind of cool slide presentation that was like way, way out how big the universe is. And the reality that the universe exists within somehow God. When they talk about how many light years, millions and billions of light years, it's insane kind of numbers. And I've been wrestling with what it means that God is this huge, big God. In the book of Job, there's this thing where God is trying to get Job to understand this. Job has been complaining, and finally he gets mad. He's been taking it and taking it and taking it. Finally he gets upset, and he starts yelling at God, which is okay. We're allowed to do it. And he yells at God, and he says, I demand that you answer me. And so finally God decides to answer Job. And just to make a point, he shows up in a tornado. Just so Job gets the gist of what's going on. Can you imagine? Again, this is a moment where imagine it. We had a tornado here last year. So imagine that you've been bitching and moaning and telling God how angry you are, and a tornado shows up, and a voice comes out of the tornado. That's Job. Now you're standing there as a person. Then the Lord answered Job from the tornado. Who is this darkening counsel with words lacking knowledge? Prepare yourself like a man. I will interrogate you, and you will respond to me. Man, I bet Job was like, I have made a terrible mistake. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me if you know who set its measurements. Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring tape on it? On what were its footings sunk? Who laid its cornerstone while the morning stars sang in unison and all the divine beings shouted? You get a feeling of the size of God's strength and power and splendor and majesty. So why have I been thinking about all this? First and foremost, because it's in the Bible. And one of the things that we believe is that the Bible still has some authority, still matters. And we can't highlight our Bibles with a black marker. That's not how we do things at Vox. We try to wrestle with the stuff that we love, and we wrestle and we sit in tension with the stuff that we don't like. And that's part of what deconstruction and reconstruction then is. And so we have to wrestle with the bits that we don't like. And one of the reasons I don't like some of this sovereignty stuff is because it's been used to hurt people for so long. I don't like the everything happens for a reason, trite answers that Christians so often give to people when tragedy strikes. I absolutely love this saying, everything happens for a reason. Sometimes the reason is you're stupid and you make bad decisions. That is 100% truth in my life over and over and over again. And those decisions that we make or the decisions that somebody else makes that then affects us, so often God gets blamed for, and I don't like that. And it bothers me. And so it's not what I'm talking about this morning. Although sometimes it is true that God does have a larger plan going on that we aren't aware of. I can look back at my life and see God's hand at work in my life over and over and over, often saving me from my own stupidity. And that's what's happening in the garden, right? In the garden, the disciples think that everything has just gone wrong. And the truth of the matter is, it's the beginning of everything going right. They think that it's the end of the world, but it's the beginning of the new world. They think it's the end of their lives, but it's actually the beginning of a new life. They think that the evil one is winning. quite frankly, so does the evil one. But he's about to lose. And so sometimes that happens. But what I'm still working on is the idea that God is big enough. What I'm still working on is this idea that God is big enough. That he's big enough to handle what's going on in my life. He's big enough to handle what's not going right. He's big enough to handle the problems that exist. That God is big enough to deal with the problems that I have created in my own life. The ones that are kind of my fault. The idea that God is big enough for me to be honest with him when things don't go the way I planned. When everything goes wrong, this idea that I can bring it all to God. I don't know what to do with that yet. I don't have a nice, simple, practical thing to say, okay, here you go. Now you can go home with this. Because to me, it feels a little bit like the mountains. Sometimes I think it's a bit like one of the reasons I love backpacking is that when we're out there, and I'm standing on top of a mountain looking out over a mountain range, it just feels like it just keeps going forever and it disappears. My problems feel so small in context. And there's a part of me that thinks there's something there with this idea that when we allow ourselves to go and to be with God, allow ourselves to be impressed with how big he is, we start realizing that at the end of the day, it's not my problem. I don't have to solve everything. That when I start scrolling through the media these days, I am not responsible for trying to fix the collapse of the cryptocurrency markets. We at Redwood are not responsible for trying to end homelessness. In fact, we never will. We're never, ever going to end homelessness. Jesus said, the poor you will have with you always. So we're just going to try to give some people a home. We can't fix the housing crisis. We can't deal, I can't even solve the financial issues that my own family has to deal with. I can't fix them all. I can just do little bits. It's not my call, my job. As a pastor of Vox, I can't make this church grow massively. It's not my job. My job is to just do this. It's my job. It's to try to lead us, worship, create space to wrestle with what you're thinking about and dealing with, give you an opportunity and a safe space to try to ask questions about faith. I can't bring God's kingdom. It's not my job. There's something about when everything falls apart that can be really discouraging, but on the other hand, there's something kind of freeing about how big God is. Do you know what I mean? But I don't know if that makes any sense whatsoever. And I don't have kind of an answer yet. I don't have a way to just sort of take that. But it gives me hope to think about. I mean, David's ending to the psalm, but I have trusted in your faithful love. My heart will rejoice in your salvation. Yes, I will sing to the Lord because he has been good to me. So where has God shown up in your life? You got some fancy pants sticky notes. Maybe you can add that on there. I don't want to wreck Carrie's plan. I'll get in trouble. Where's God shown up in your life in the past? Right now, if you're angry, right now, if you're frustrated, can you look back and actually see him? Can you look back and see that he showed up? Roy talks about this with his testimony. There was a moment where he just about was done with everything. And all of a sudden he began to realize, and I love the line he says, but it was Jesus. It was always Jesus. He could look back and he could see all of the moments that Jesus had shown up in his life, that it all led to where he was, that God had been at work all that time. Where have you seen God in control, sovereignly working things out? And we remind ourselves that even in moments like we're living through at the moment, God is still on the throne. God is still sovereign, even when it doesn't feel like it, even when it seems as if everything is all falling apart. It doesn't make it go away. Doesn't make the anger and frustration and hurt you might be feeling instantly disappear, but I think it makes it easier to deal with. I look back at what God has done for me, and I can take another step into tomorrow. I look back at where God has shown up, and I can trust that tomorrow he'll keep being sovereign. Tomorrow he'll keep acting and working in the world for his glory and for my good. Because I'm able to look back, I'm able to praise him now, and tomorrow he is big enough for all of that. I'm going to ask the worship team. I'm going to ask Jen to come on up. We're going to do a song as a new song.